The story begins with a team of explorers in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. They are sailing on a large ship. On board, there is a weather official named David, whose job is to record and report weather conditions. The destination of their journey is a remote island located right in the middle of the ocean, where the government has sent David so he can observe the weather changes happening there. David is assigned to live there for an entire year, collecting weather data every day, and then return once his duty is complete. For this purpose, David has been provided with a year's supply of food and all the equipment he needs to survive completely on his own. After a long journey spanning many days, the ship finally arrives near the destination island. They disembark using a small boat and land on the island, which looks incredibly silent and eerie. Not a single bird flies in the sky, nor is there any sound of life heard on the island. There is only a lighthouse and a small house, and that house will later become David's residence. Previously, the island was inhabited by another weather officer named Robert. He had undergone the exact same duty, living alone for a full year to collect weather data. Now Robert's term of duty has ended, and David is here to replace him. However, when the entire team visits the house, they are shocked because there are no signs of human presence. The house is completely empty, and the belongings of the previous officer are scattered around as if the place had been abandoned suddenly. Seeing this condition, the ship's captain and David think that someone might be at the lighthouse, and without wasting any time, they head straight there. However, upon arriving at the lighthouse, they witness a very bizarre sight. The entire lighthouse building is surrounded by sharp, pointed wooden stakes resembling a defensive fortress, as if the wood was intentionally installed to block anyone from entering. The captain and David knock on the lighthouse door multiple times, but there is absolutely no answer, until they finally force their way inside. Inside the lighthouse, they encounter a man named Granner. When the captain and David ask about the whereabouts of Robert, the previous weather officer, Granner answers that Robert is dead because, according to him, Robert walked out toward the sea and never returned. Hearing this answer, David and the captain are instantly shocked. Afterward, the captain tells David that he feels something is deeply wrong with this place, and he invites David to return with them on the ship. However, David declines the offer because he believes that if he successfully delivers accurate weather reports from this island, the government will give him a massive reward. In the end, the captain hands a pistol over to David to protect himself, while also warning him that the place does not look safe and telling David to be careful. After that, the ship sails away, leaving David all alone on the island, and they won't return to pick him up until a year later. Once the captain leaves, David begins to tidy up the house to make it livable. That night, while organizing his things, David finds a diary hidden inside a drawer, which turns out to belong to Robert, the previous weather officer. In the diary, Robert wrote many things about the island, but there is something that makes David feel deeply uncomfortable. On several pages, Robert wrote about mysterious creatures. The notes are incomplete, with many sections cut off and unclear. Furthermore, the book contains sketches of strange creatures that David has never seen before. This naturally makes David wonder why Robert would draw such things, and he starts to think that maybe Robert did it out of sheer boredom. On one of the pages, a photo of Robert's wife is neatly pasted. David continues reading the book late into the night. The next morning, David wakes up and immediately begins his new routine as a weather officer. He records the temperature, wind direction, and sea conditions. Everything looks perfectly normal, even though the island's atmosphere remains peculiar and intensely quiet. While walking near the beach to observe the sea conditions, David's steps suddenly grind to a halt. He sees something highly unusual. Among the rocky reefs, there is an arrangement of stones forming a strange pattern, adorned with seashells. The pattern looks intentionally arranged, rather than formed naturally. David feels bewildered and suspects that Granner might have made it. With an uneasy feeling, He chooses to return home and continue his work. In the afternoon, David observes the lighthouse from a distance using binoculars, through which he spots Granner standing in front of the lighthouse. But to his surprise, Granner does not seem to be alone. There is a strange, creature-like figure standing near him. David tries to focus his vision, but suddenly the figure vanishes into thin air. David figures his eyes are just playing tricks on him, or his mind is starting to hallucinate because he has been living alone for too long. As night approaches, the wind blows increasingly harder, and the sky turns pitch black. David returns to the house and stays busy recording data. At that moment, David suddenly hears someone knocking on the door. David freezes upon hearing it, then calls out Granner's name, assuming it is Granner visiting. However, as David keeps calling out Granner's name, there is no response. Filled with worry, David approaches the door while carrying a lantern, and right then, he hears a bizarre sound from outside. A sound that doesn't resemble a human voice at all. Suddenly, David is overcome by an overwhelming sense of dread. He backs away slowly, runs down to the basement and hides. Not long after, the house door is successfully smashed open. The creature enters and begins to ransack the house, as if knowing that David is still inside. With his heart pounding furiously, David peeks through a tiny gap. As the creature draws near, David reflexively stabs a knife directly into its eye, causing the creature to let out a loud shriek. David falls back, completely exhausted and shaking with fear. That night, David cannot sleep, as he is now certain that what Robert wrote in the diary was not a mere fantasy. The next morning, David steps outside with extreme caution. Down along the shoreline, he discovers bizarre footprints leading into the sea, footprints that are clearly not human. It is then that David finally understands why the lighthouse is surrounded by pointed wooden stakes. Panic-stricken, David runs to the lighthouse and begs Granner to open the door, telling him about what he experienced the night before. However, Granner refuses to help him, saying that David should have left with the ship yesterday. Granner even splashes water on David from atop the lighthouse to force him to leave. Left with no choice, David returns to the house and begins to prepare for the return of the strange creatures. He boards up the windows with wooden planks, installs sharp wooden stakes all around the house, and piles up books and papers in front of the door. He then pours oil around his house, intending to set the creatures on fire immediately if they return. While cleaning the house, David uncovers an old, hidden chest containing a weapon and ammunition. This discovery gives him a slight sense of security, even though fear still heavily blankets him. In short, night falls. From behind the window, David sees something that freezes his blood. He sees not just one, but a massive swarm of creatures emerging from the sea. They can be seen crawling, rising from the waves, and slowly closing in on David's house. They begin slamming against the door and windows. David shoots several of them, but the creatures only grow more brutal. They roar, howl, and try to break in from every direction. In his panic, David sets fire to the pile of papers in front of the door. The fire flares up, forcing the creatures to retreat toward the sea. However, the flames quickly spread across the entire structure, and the wooden house burns down rapidly. David is forced to flee and hides behind a large boulder near the lighthouse. Shortly after, a heavy downpour begins and puts out the fire, but David's house has already been reduced to ashes. Now the only shelter left is the lighthouse. Homeless and haunted by constant fear, David has no choice but to stake out the lighthouse. He watches Granner's movements, waiting for the right moment to approach. But before he can draw near, something suddenly attacks him from behind. It is a creature identical to the ones from the night before. David fights back, and in his state of panic he almost kills the creature. But right before that happens, Granner yells and stops him. Granner angrily states that the creature must not be killed because she belongs to him. David is completely stunned, as he never expected Granner to have a connection with these creatures. Granner forces David into the lighthouse. There, Granner tells David that he only has one choice if he wants to survive: stay in the lighthouse and obey all his rules. Hearing this, David sets a condition, stating that if Granner wants the creature to remain alive, then he must allow David to stay in the lighthouse. Granner ultimately agrees. David takes up residence inside the lighthouse, the very place he had been avoiding. Inside, he sees Granner's chaotic living conditions. The lighthouse is filled with the smell of alcohol, broken equipment, and signs of utter despair. The next morning, David wakes up suddenly, feeling a sharp pain in his hand. However, when he looks at his wound, he is shocked to see it has completely healed. Beside him, the female sea creature is licking David's hand. Seeing this, David sits frozen, realizing that the creature possesses healing abilities. David then thinks that if this secret is brought to the outside world, everything will change. But when he pitches this idea to Granner, Granner flatly rejects it, because to him, this island is his entire world and he has no desire to leave it. Granner then reveals his dark secret. The reason the female creature is loyal to him is that Granner saved her when she was small, and since then, the creature became captivated by Granner's kindness. However, instead of protecting her, Granner treats her with extreme cruelty, forcing her to submit to his will. Every night, the other sea creatures attack the lighthouse with the sole intention of rescuing the female creature. Yet they always fail because the daytime sunlight burns their skin, forcing them back into the ocean before dawn arrives. David begins to realize that these creatures are not mindless monsters, but living beings with feelings and deep bonds with one another. Day after day passes and David is forced into a brutal routine. Every night he must fight off the sea creatures, while during the day he helps Granner work and refills the water supply.
Wake up, man, wake up!
Time passes and David's feelings gradually shift. He begins to feel immense pity for the female creature. David eventually gives her a name, Anaris. Here, David sees a profound sadness in Anaris's eyes, the grief of being separated from her kind. Strangely, as time goes on, the attacks begin to dwindle. Granner assumes that this is merely the calm before a massive storm, believing that the sea creatures are preparing a full-scale assault against them. Not long after, they discover dynamite from a shipwreck stranded around the island. Seeing this, Granner feels he has a golden opportunity and begins formulating a plan to obliterate the sea creatures once and for all. In short, several months fly by. Winter arrives and snow begins to blanket the island. Peculiarly, the sea creatures' attacks halt completely. There are no cries from the sea, no shadows among the waves, as if they know a massive trap has been set for them. Realizing this, Granner grows suspicious, accuses Anaris of warning the other monsters. Granner flies into a rage and begins torturing Anaris again. Unable to stand the sight of it, David finally fights back against Granner. Ultimately, they agree to a final defensive plan. The lighthouse's main door will be left open, and once the creatures enter, 2 layers of dynamite will be detonated simultaneously. However, David secretly has another plan. That night, David tells Anaris to climb to the top of the lighthouse and scream. As Anaris's cry echoes out across the sea, it awakens the fury of the sea creatures. From a distance, dozens of creatures emerge from the water, moving rapidly toward the lighthouse. Seeing the door open, they all think this is their final chance to save Anaris, and the moment they enter, a chaotic battle instantly erupts. During the clash, David is nearly killed but somehow manages to survive. When all the creatures gather around the lighthouse base, Granner pulls the dynamite lever, but absolutely nothing happens. Unknown to Granner, David had severed the dynamite connection. Granner begins to panic while the creatures start scaling the lighthouse. David runs over, reconnects the dynamite cables, and detonates the first layer, though some of the creatures survive. In his madness and fury, Granner detonates the second layer, causing an explosion that knocks both David and Granner unconscious. Come morning, the lighthouse grounds are shown to be littered with the corpses of the sea creatures, And Anarus has vanished as well. The wounded creatures are dragged by Granner and slaughtered one by one without a shred of mercy. It is at that moment that David spots something that changes everything. Hanging around the neck of one of the dead creatures is a necklace symbolizing family. David finally realizes they are not monsters. They are living beings who have families, children, and emotional bonds just like humans. In short, from that day forward, there are no more attacks, but every night David hears weeping echoing from the sea. He realizes they decimated a whole community out of sheer fear and misunderstanding. One morning, David sees the children of the sea creatures wandering the beach, confused and left without their families. Overcome with deep remorse, David arranges a circle of stones and places a small, handmade toy boat in the center as a token of peace. He waits for hours hoping Anarus will appear, but she doesn't show up. The next morning, David finds an old photograph belonging to Granner, and the photo is identical to the one inside Robert's diary. Here, the truth is finally unveiled. Granner is actually Robert. David discovers that Robert never died. He merely changed his identity because he refused to leave the island. David also learns the reason Robert wanted to stay. It was tied to his wife. After Robert's wife passed away, he fell into intense loneliness, and madness gradually destroyed his mind. In the evening, David returns to the beach. He sees that the toy boat he made has been moved, and a child of the sea creatures is standing there holding it. David lights a wooden stick and places it in the middle of the circle to signal that he has no intention of attacking. Finally, Anarus emerges, followed by the rest of her kind, and for the first time they do not attack because all they want now is peace. Suddenly, Granner appears with a gun in his hand, because to him, if there is no fear, he is nobody. Without hesitation, he fires the weapon, instantly killing a child creature. Witnessing this, the sea creatures flee in terror, while Anarus looks at David, believing this was his plan to trap them all. Consumed by rage, David attacks Granner. As Granner moves to kill him, David calls out Granner's real name, Robert. Hearing that name, Robert freezes. He realizes that everything he has done was merely for power to remedy his own loneliness. Recognizing his toxic obsession and guilt, he surrenders himself to the creatures, who quickly take his life, while David locks himself inside the lighthouse. A year passes, and a government ship arrives carrying a new officer and a new weather official. When they ask about the previous officer, David gives the exact same answer Granner once gave. The old officer went out to sea and never returned. David decides to stay on the island entirely on his own, while Anarus and the other creatures finally live freely in the sea and on the island without fear. The film closes by showing the island, once again quiet and peaceful.